Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin by running you through a brief exercise. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of the word ableism. Okay, that's not bad. Now raise your hand if you've ever used the word ableist to describe a problem that you perceived as unequal. Okay, a lot fewer. Now if you didn't raise your hand to one or both of those, you're not alone. Very few people actively frame the problems that they face as ableist. The word just hasn't really entered our vocabulary, like other terms for different forms of oppression have. In fact, when I was dictating this very presentation onto a Google Doc, Google kept trying to autocorrect the word ableist. It hadn't even been entered into whatever dictionary Google was referencing. But what is ableism? Ableism is a form of discrimination in favor of able-bodied people and a discrimination against people with disabilities. Ableism creates a hostile environment for people whose bodies just don't fit the able-bodied norm. And in my opinion, ableism remains one of the last broad, socially acceptable forms of discrimination. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering, why is this perfectly healthy-looking person standing in front of you talking about ableism? And honestly, I think that's a pretty fair point, but it's also an assumption. I have an invisible disability, and learning to live with an invisible disability is part of the story that I want to share with you today. I became disabled when I was 16 with a really mysterious neuromuscular pain syndrome. And it was then, and remains to this day, a medical mystery. But I have one particular type of disability, which comes with its own set of problems and experiences. And when I talk about ableism today, broadly construed, I might be talking about things and experiences that will differ drastically from my own. Disability is complicated. There's no one way to be disabled. And I'm not going to stand up here today and talk to you about how my disability is easier or harder to live with than someone else's, because to me that entirely misses the point. And the point is that there remains work to be done when it comes to combating ableism. Ableism is insidious. It's coded everywhere into our society, even into our language. We use the word upstanding, for example, to refer to someone who we think is great, without even stopping to think about what that says about how we view people who can't walk. In the media, disability often takes the form of three major stock characters. There's the disabled villain, the disabled victim, and the disabled superhero, who somehow seems to overcome the very definitional limits of their disability. And although there are positives and negatives associated with those stereotypes, I really want to dwell upon the disabled villain. Every Halloween, people dress up as monsters and ghouls and evil spirits, and they dress up as the disabled. Now, it's not just that we're coding disability to be something that's sad or pathetic. The disabled villain is the explicit manifestation of our societal fear of and disdain for disabled people. And now, unfortunately, this doesn't just happen in movies. Throughout history, disability and ableism has been used as an axis of oppression that often transgresses many of our common conceptions of the boundaries around different oppressed peoples. During the Second World War, anyone who was labeled as unproductive to the cause and the creation of the Aryan nation was labeled for extermination. Jews were referred to as parasites that sapped the resources of the state. The LGBTQ community was referred to as unproductive because of their literal inability to reproduce. And over 200,000 people who were labeled as handicapped were either imprisoned or murdered because of their inability to be productive members of society. Another example of ableism being used as an axis of oppression comes to us from the historical conception of what it means to be a woman. Freud often referred to women as defective men. And throughout history, women have been oppressed based on what they were perceived to be capable of or not. I think female hysteria, the medicalization of a perfectly healthy, normal, sexually active female woman, is a really wonderful example of this really horrendous problem. And now each of these cases tells us something oppressive and pretty awful about each of these categories of people. But what often gets lost in the midst of that is the fact that each of these cases also say something oppressive and awful about anyone whose body is different from those that are deemed to be normal, or anyone who's deemed to be less productive than the rest of society. But rarely do we actively stop to think about what productivity actually means. Virginia Woolf referred to this narrow obsession that we have with productivity to no real clear end goal as the army of the upright. And today, I think it's really important that we face that army head on. But see, there are a lot of ways that we could go about trying to combat ableism. It's just a really huge problem. We could go about it by talking about law and policy, and we can address representation in the media. But I think that fundamentally, combating ableism begins right here. It begins with reconceptualizing what it means for someone to be disabled. It means believing that there's actually something worth fighting for. Elizabeth Barnes, a professor of philosophy at the University of Virginia, did exactly that. Barnes's reconception of what it means for someone to be disabled is called the mere difference view. And although I'm going to be oversimplifying it a little bit, its main idea is that the problem that people with disabilities face are often rooted in the way that society is structured. And it's not innate to their physical beings. Being disabled is just a merely different way of having a body. Now, I think in order to really understand and grasp the mere difference view, it's really useful to imagine a thought experiment. So consider someone who's a member of the deaf community. In our dominantly hearing society, we often think of this person as disabled because they are incapable of doing many things that we believe that normal people can do. But when we view this person in the context with the rest of the deaf community, it's really not so clear that they're actually disabled. In fact, many members of the deaf community don't think of themselves as disabled. And when someone who's not a member of the deaf community enters, they often find themselves feeling as if they take on the role that we associate being disabled to have. They might find themselves feeling out of touch with deaf culture, or isolated from their peers, or less able to contribute than their ostensibly disabled counterparts. But now let's take this idea farther. And imagine that almost everyone in this society is a member of the deaf community. Our teachers are deaf and make lesson plans that reflect that fact. Our politicians are deaf and they write laws and policies that reflect the habits and interests of the deaf community. But you are not deaf. You are subject to awful and distracting noises, which decrease your productivity, which decrease your ability to sleep. You feel isolated from the rest of the world around you. You feel really different and perhaps even alone. And everyone looks down on you with pity because you were born with the disabling effects of having been born with hearing. Now, this is what it means for disability to be socially constructed. It's not that there aren't real physical limitations that people face. It's just that the way society is structured has made having some of those physical differences a lot harder than having others. In other words, there's nothing innately better or worse about having hearing or not, any more than there's something innately better or worse about being a woman. It's just that the way society has been structured has made it a lot harder to be a woman throughout history. Now, if maybe at this point you haven't totally bought into the mere difference view, I understand that. It's kind of a hard thing to wrap your head around or really buy into. But I hope that you're willing to take the leap of faith in imagining what a world with the mere difference view in it could look like. And to get you into that mindset, I want to share with you how the mere difference view has changed the way that I view my disability. 4 years ago, that medical mystery entered my life. My arms began to shut down. I was in a lot of pain. And I was 16. I had just qualified for my first national championships in swimming. And like most 16-year-olds, I was really, really excited about the fact that I was finally kind of finding my stride and getting into the things that I really, truly loved. Back then, I really considered myself 3 things: a swimmer, a pianist, and a cellist. And today, I stand before you as none of those things. When I first realized that my disability was here to stay, I simultaneously knew that I would be okay, and I felt like my world was ending. It was as if in the blink of an eye, everything I dedicated the last decade of my life to had just suddenly disappeared. And I was just left in this vacuum of inadequacy. Now, this was back in the summer before my junior year. And I remember thinking then that because I couldn't write or type for any period of time, that I was genuinely afraid to go back to school. And honestly, those fears were not unfounded. Relearning how to go back to school was one of the hardest things that I've ever done. I really struggled with feeling isolated, like nobody would believe me because I didn't have a label to put on my disability. And I was really frustrated by the fact that I was just getting slower and slower and slower at things that used to take me just minutes and that were mindless. And I think more than anything, I really struggled with just coping with the fact that I had lost basically everything I had dedicated my life to. But gradually, things kind of began to improve. I learned to start focusing on what I could do rather than what I couldn't. And I had a lot of people there to support me and help me along the way. And that attitude just kind of kept growing and growing and growing until eventually I found myself here at this institution. But I'm not going to stand here and pretend like I'm effortlessly living with this disability, because I think that that's honestly kind of just unfair to myself and the experience. What they don't tell you when you get into this school for having overcome things is that when you get here, you have to keep overcoming those same things. And that can be really frustrating. It can be really, really hard to just stand and watch your peers do things that they often just take for granted, that I know I will spend hours literally agonizing over. But I'm proud to be able to stand before you today and share the fact that I have learned how to refocus my life. I actually started coaching swimming as a means to get back into the sport that I loved so much. And just this past year, I joined the Yale Glee Club, which has been an amazing way to get back into music after so many years. And now I'm telling you all of this not because I want you to feel pity or because I want you to feel inspired by what I'm saying, but what I want you to realize is that for me, the mere difference view isn't simply theoretical. The mere difference view is the difference between standing in front of the mirror and seeing someone who is innately less than their 16-year-old self, and seeing someone who just has a different body with a different life experience. The mere difference view is the difference between feeling the need to constantly fight to overcome my disability, like those headlines said, and learning to live with, accept, and even be proud of the fact that I am disabled. The mere difference view isn't just about being nicer to disabled people, although I think that's a great place to start. It's a whole lot bigger than that. The mere difference view is to see value where other people see none. The mere difference view is to choose to usurp that history of ableism. The mere difference view is to choose to believe that we are all truly equal in our differences. Every one of us has the power to tap into that equality. And it can be as simple as just changing our frame of mind, changing the way that we look at the people around us. And now at this point, you might be wondering, how do we use it? How do we tap into that? Into that, honestly, I think we all already know. This is a picture of Stephen Hawking. And I would feel pretty uncomfortable if I were to stand up here and say, you know what, Stephen Hawking was a burden to our society because he couldn't walk. We look at Stephen Hawking and we see someone who was brilliant. We value Stephen Hawking as someone who was merely different. But just because Stephen Hawking was exceptionally brilliant doesn't mean that he has to be the exception to the norm. I stand before you today because of people who believed in the power to view other people as merely different. My English professor, Schiffer Charlin, when I got here this past year, looked at me with genuine excitement when I told her that I had to dictate my work, because she said that she was thrilled by the idea of someone engaging in an entirely new form of art. That's the kind of power that each and every one of us wields. And if you remember anything from this talk today, I want it to be this. When you encounter someone who is maybe physically or mentally different from you, or perhaps you find yourself in a position where you are physically or mentally different than you once were, I want you to remember that you have a choice. You can choose to look at things through the historical lens of ableism and just see a mountain of shortcomings. Or you can choose to see value. You can choose to see people as innately less, or you can choose to see people as innately equal. But why choose less than when you can choose equal? Truly. We all have the power to make that choice. And imagine how much better of a world we would live in if we all went out and actually used that power. Which begs the question, why haven't we? At the beginning of this talk, I asked you how familiar you were with ableism. And the responses were definitely less than unanimous. But see, to tap into the power of the mere difference view, we have to start using the word ableism first. We have to believe that there is actually a problem before we can go out and fix it. We have to talk about it. So talk about it. Start a conversation about ableism. Because only then can we all truly engage with the power that each and every one of us has to make this world merely different. Thank you.